Can you believe that at the absolute height of the Industrial Revolution, when cities were blazing with electric light and transatlantic steamships ruled the waves, there were entire civilizations tucked away in the shadows of Europe that were still fighting the Middle Ages? I'm talking about a world where the year 1900 was just a meaningless number, a world where survival hinged not on the stock market, but on the size of your woodpile and the strength of the ice covering your roof. This is the story of the forgotten valleys, the places time simply decided to skip over, hidden deep within the treacherous spines of the Alps and the Pyrenees, small pockets of humanity that had perfected the art of extreme, life-or-death isolation.
They lived on the knife edge of existence, an existence defined by the brutal, merciless 6-month siege known locally as the Long Sleep. But in the autumn of that pivotal year, something went horrifyingly wrong. A catastrophe no one saw coming, an environmental betrayal that threatened to wipe their entire ancient way of life off the map, leaving nothing but frozen relics behind.
We are focusing on the tiny, impossibly stubborn community of Valdrega, a cluster of stone and timber clinging desperately to the side of a gorge, accessible only by a single treacherous mountain pass known as the Serpent's Coil. For generations, their ancestors had read the signs, the height of the berries, the migration patterns of the mountain goat, the specific taste of the autumn wind, to predict the coming winter. Their entire social fabric, their very religion, was built around the successful hoarding and distribution of resources before the inevitable blockade. The elders had calculated, using methods unchanged since the 13th century, that they had a comfortable 6 weeks left before the first serious snows would seal the valley shut. 6 weeks to finish curing the last of the meat, 6 weeks to haul the remaining hay down from the higher pastures, 6 weeks for the young men to shore up the leaky dam that fed their precious winter water supply. 6 weeks of frantic, exhausting preparation, believing they had time on their side. They were wrong, so catastrophically wrong, that the very air began to vibrate with dread the moment the sun dipped below the eastern peaks on what should have been a warm, golden Tuesday afternoon. The sky, usually a brilliant blue dome, began to take on a sickly, bruised purple color, the kind of hue that mountain folk know instantly is a harbinger of true evil descending. Old Man Ilara, the valley's self-appointed weather prophet, who had correctly predicted every harsh winter for 50 years, suddenly dropped the axe he was holding, the heavy iron head sinking deep into the frozen mud. His eyes, usually sharp and clear, were wide with a terror that reached back centuries. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He was staring straight up. What he saw wasn't a cloud formation. It was a wall, a titanic, suffocating, swirling mass of brilliant white that looked less like weather and more like the physical manifestation of the end times rolling in from the north. This wasn't the gentle, dusting snowfall they were expecting. This was the opening salvo of a geological war, a tempest scale that had accelerated weeks ahead of schedule.
It was a blizzard so fierce, so instantaneous, that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. One moment, the children were playing in dry leaves. The next, visibility dropped to zero, and the first flakes were not soft and pleasant, but razor-sharp needles of ice, driven by winds that sounded like the screams of condemned souls. The temperature didn't drop incrementally. It plummeted, executing a vertical dive that instantly flash froze the exposed water in the community well. This wasn't just an early winter. This was a medieval siege delivered by Mother Nature herself. A swift, decisive strike that caught Valdriga entirely unprepared, stripping them of those crucial 6 weeks of survival grace. The immediate panic was a deafening roar of fear, a primal scramble as fathers abandoned their outdoor tasks and sprinted toward their homes, knowing that every second lost meant less warmth, less food, and a greater chance of literally freezing where they stood. The very first victim of this catastrophic meteorological ambush was young Thomas, a boy barely 12 years old, who had been assigned the task of retrieving the last 3 stray sheep from the upper meadow. When the storm hit, he was 2 miles from the safety of the valley, high on the exposed ridge. His desperate cries for help were instantly swallowed by the roaring wind, and the snow began piling up so fast that within minutes the path he had trod was erased, replaced by an indistinguishable, deadly white blanket. His father, Juraj, a man whose strength was legendary even among these hardened mountaineers, knew the dreadful mathematics instantly. If Thomas wasn't found within the hour, the chilling embrace of the valley winter would claim him forever. But Juraj couldn't even see the wall of his own barn, let alone the high meadow. The suddenness of the event had paralyzed the community, forcing them into immediate defensive lockdown, prioritizing the survival of the many over the rescue of the one. The horror intensified as the community realized the true extent of the early freeze. The wood they had stacked, the essential fuel for 6 months of darkness, was still seasoning outdoors, now instantly coated in thick, impenetrable ice, making it nearly impossible to split or burn effectively. Furthermore, the small, crucial supply of barley they had earmarked for grinding was still sitting in the temporary shed near the river, a shed that was now dangerously close to being submerged under the rapidly rising, freezing waters. They were cut off, locked down, and facing a 6-month famine and deep freeze, based purely on the catastrophic failure of a single, crucial weather prediction. The silence that followed the initial chaos was the worst sound of all. The deep, heavy blanket of snow, muffling every sound, separating neighbor from neighbor, transforming their familiar valley into an alien, hostile world. And this was only the first hour. Valdriga, a town that existed outside of time, was about to discover exactly what happens when the 20th century forgets you, and the 13th century sends its most brutal weapon to finish the job. Get ready, because what these forgotten people endured over the next 180 days is absolutely unbelievable.
Their medieval winter had just begun, and the odds of anyone surviving were plummeting faster than the temperature outside. The ancient fight for warmth, food, and light had been restarted, but this time the enemy was stronger, swifter, and utterly relentless. The roar of the blizzard had subsided, not into peace, but into an unnatural, heavy silence. The sound of a world utterly suffocated and pressed flat by crystalline terror. When the elders, their faces etched with the hard lessons of generations past, finally dared to look out, they confirmed the horrifying truth. The devil's early harvest was complete. The pass, their only brittle connection to the electric lights and paved roads of the modern world, was not merely blocked. It was entombed under 30 feet of murderous, compacted snow and glacial ice, a perfect, impenetrable seal. The village of Valençon, situated at the deep, narrow end of the Alpine cleft, was instantly transformed into a perfect, terrifying time capsule. It was 1900 on the global calendar, but that calendar had become an irrelevant joke, a cruel parchment reminding them of the certainty and comfort they had instantaneously lost to the meteorological ambush. Their small, sputtering dynamo, which usually drew power from the cascading creek and provided them with a few precious hours of electric light, had frozen solid within the first 12 hours of the storm, its gears locked in a sheath of impenetrable ice. They were blind, deaf, and completely alone. The single thin telegraph wire strung across the high, wind-whipped peaks, the very symbol of their slow, grudging acceptance of the outside world, had snapped under the sheer, brutal weight of the ice shield, a soundless, invisible severing that marked their complete, instantaneous regression to the dark ages of isolation. All the technological advances of the 19th century were rendered meaningless by a few days of concentrated, medieval cold. Survival in the high valleys was always a rigorous mathematical equation, solved in the brief, frantic summer months, and that equation had just been violently and fatally erased. Mayor Anselm, a man who prided himself on his meticulous, modern bookkeeping, slammed his fist onto the communal table until the bones of his hand ached, the sound muffled by the thick stone walls of the council hall. The reserves were calculated to last precisely until the first week of April, provided the winter began on its predictable schedule around December 10th. It was now late October. They were suddenly facing 5 months of siege instead of 3.5, but with rations calculated for the shorter duration, compounded by the catastrophic loss of the late-season harvest that was still sitting unprotected in the upper fields when the ice bomb hit with zero warning. The community's careful timeline had been compressed, leaving them in a horrifying resource debt they had no visible means of repaying. The most immediate critical failure was the livestock feed. The massive hay barn in the lower meadow, which housed nearly 40% of the necessary winter forage for the oxen and milk cows, had been completely crushed under a localized avalanche triggered by the initial storm surge, its contents rendered sodden, rotten, and useless. Without that hay, the community faced a brutal choice that no generation had wanted to make: cull the herds immediately or watch them starve slowly, forcing them to consume the meager, vital grain intended for human mouths.
The cows, the goats, the oxen, they were not just meat. They were capital. They were future milk, future muscle for the spring plow. And the terrifying realization was that keeping them alive meant sacrificing children's bellies in the long, dark months to come. Every animal that drew breath was now a profound liability, a living drain on the village's quickly vanishing capital. Then there was the fuel. Warmth was the first, most fundamental line of defense against the relentless cold that sought to extinguish every spark of life in Valençon. The stored firewood was extensive, yes, but crucially, it was green. The final essential weeks of drying time, meant to bake out the last vestiges of moisture, had been brutally stolen by the premature freeze. Burning wet wood was intensely inefficient, smoky and dangerously slow. It meant that every crucial calorie of wood was wasted, producing more steam and acrid, lung-fouling smoke than heat, failing to properly charge the massive stone hearths designed to radiate warmth for hours. This inefficient burn rate meant their wood reserves, previously assessed as sturdy, would now vanish twice as fast, turning a long-term problem into a terrifying, immediate scarcity that dominated every waking thought. The wood-gatherers, led by the stoic but increasingly desperate young man named Luke, reported back. The forest, usually a comforting source of endless resource, was now an icy, treacherous fortress. Trees were encased in brittle shells of ice, ready to splinter or fall without warning, and the deep drifts made dragging back the massive logs a caloric sacrifice that the men could not afford to make. Every swing of the heavy axe, every breath taken in the frigid air, was a calculated transaction against their dwindling energy reserves. They were literally mining their own bodies just to secure the basic materials needed to delay their inevitable freezing deaths. A vicious, self-defeating cycle of physical and caloric depletion. The catastrophe was not just material, it was profoundly psychological. The suddenness and unnatural severity of the storm shattered the fragile shield of scientific certainty the younger generation had built over the last 2 decades. The young men who had openly scoffed at the ancient tales of the malignant cold and the ice golem that guarded the peaks, now looked nervously at the jagged, frosted skyline, their skepticism replaced by primal dread. Their grandfathers had been right, terrifyingly so. The mountain was alive, and it was angry, responding to some perceived transgression. This early winter was not a mere meteorological anomaly explained by barometric pressure. It was a curse, a sign of cosmic displeasure directed squarely at Valençon for straying too far from the old, reverent ways. This toxic return to superstition created a dangerous fissure in the community's already frayed resolve. The elders demanded ritual sacrifices, the burning of specific aromatic herbs, the reciting of forbidden ancient prayers, actions that the pragmatic younger generation
viewed as a reckless waste of vital resources and precious time. This internal conflict simmered just beneath the surface of the crisis, threatening to explode into outright division and paralyze crucial survival efforts. Could they afford to waste even a handful of dried thyme on a prayer, when that herb might be the only thing seasoning the bland, repetitive gruel that kept severe hunger at bay in February? The underlying question was simple, desperate, and existential. Would they rely on the logic of 1900 or the terrifying, proven wisdom of 1400? The choice was ultimately forced upon them by the first, unavoidable casualty. Old man Tiernan's prize ox, Samson, a beast of legendary strength and irreplaceable worth, collapsed suddenly in the middle of the night, succumbing to a combination of cold shock and chronic lack of proper forage. It was a clear, brutal signpost, pointing toward the inevitable starvation of the entire remaining herd if they hesitated one day longer. Mayor Anselm, his voice now a gravelly whisper choked with emotion, gathered the council again, the small chamber thick with the smell of damp wool and cold, paralyzing fear. They had to choose the lesser evil immediately. To save the men, they must sacrifice the beasts. The agonizing decision was made to begin the immediate, methodical, and heartbreaking slaughter of every animal they could not reasonably feed through the extreme winter, focusing only on preserving the few crucial breeding stocks needed for spring revival. This was not just butchery. It was a monumental operation of preservation that required enormous, frantic planning. They had to process the vast quantity of meat quickly before the already freezing temperatures ruined the quality. But they lacked the necessary salt for long-term curing, as their last shipment had been due to arrive over the now sealed pass. They began smoking the meat in the communal smokehouse, working around the clock under the flickering, meager light of tallow candles, their eyes burning from the thick, continuous haze of the slow, smoldering fires. Every pound of cured meat was a desperate promise of survival, but every ounce of wood used to cure it was one less ounce available to warm a child's bed at night. The terrible trade-off was the only currency left in Valençon, and it was rapidly devaluing into raw hunger and fear. The heavy, metallic scent of the slaughter hung over the entire village for days, a gruesome perfume of absolute desperation that solidified the terrifying truth in every heart. The modern world was a brittle memory, and Valençon had become an island in time, locked in a brutal, prehistoric struggle for its very right to exist, against the merciless, indifferent wrath of the mountain. The snow did not stop. It was not a storm. It was the establishment of a new, geological reality. Day 7 dawned, less a sunrise and more a slight, grayish dilution of the eternal gloom that pressed against the thick shutters of Valençon. Inside the massive stone storehouse, where the air was already heavy with the scent of damp wool and rising panic, Mayor Antoine Dubois held the flickering lantern high above the remaining stacks of cured meats and dried grain. His face, usually ruddy and confident, was now etched with the terrible mathematics of starvation.
They had planned for the normal, anticipated first snow of late November, maybe even early December. This ambush, delivered in the first week of October, had stolen nearly 6 weeks of essential preparation time, and, worse, left the majority of the summer harvest stranded beneath 10 feet of unforgiving, frozen white concrete.
The initial shock had given way to a grinding, brutal calculation. Every hour was a unit of consumption. Every forgotten resource a nail in the coffin. The existential threat was no longer the isolation itself, but the cruel, accelerating speed at which their carefully hoarded supplies were dissolving into nothingness.
The human stomach could wait, perhaps suffer, and rely on the body's reserves for a short while. But the livestock, the muscle of the community, the irreplaceable engine of the next year's survival, they operated on a biological clock that demanded constant, immediate fuel. The haylofts were catastrophic. What should have been towering banks of dried fodder were now nothing but waterlogged, moldering wreckage, crushed and spoiled by the sheer weight of the impossible snow load that had descended without warning.
Dubois counted the heads, his breath misting in the frigid air. 42 cows, 18 oxen, 216 sheep. Each number represented not just meat or milk, but the future plowing, the wool for the next generation, the very possibility of recommencing agriculture when the spring eventually returned.
The cruel calculation was simple and medieval in its starkness. They had enough salvageable feed, if rationed with absolute precision, to keep maybe a third of the herd alive until the traditional start of winter in late November. If the storm persisted, they had perhaps 2 weeks before the feeding crisis became irreversible. The rest of the animals were doomed, a walking, breathing buffer against their own extinction. This wasn't farming, it was triage. It was the brutal culling that their great-grandparents had often spoken of, a desperate practice they had believed relegated forever to the dusty pages of history books, myths whispered around a safe, modern hearth. In another world, a world just 100 miles down the mountain road, a telegram would have been sent, a relief train dispatched, perhaps even the burgeoning technology of the motor vehicle brought in to break the road. But Valençon was not in that world anymore. The copper wires of the single telegraph line, the great symbol of their tenuous connection to the industrial age, lay snapped and buried somewhere beneath the ice sheet, ripped apart by the relentless screaming wind that had devoured the high passes. The 20th century had promised salvation, yet it had delivered only silence. They were modern men, yet they were utterly reliant on medieval resilience. Their knowledge of steam engines, of political events, of electrical theory, all useless against the primal enemy of the mountain that had decided, simply, that their time was up. The decree came down like a stone tablet, whispered from house to house by the grim-faced community elders. 2 ounces of grain per adult,
1 ounce for children per day. Meat rations were suspended entirely, reserved only for the sick and the children under 5. And even those supplies were heartbreakingly finite. The communal spirit, which had been the bedrock of the isolated valley for centuries, began to crack under the intolerable weight of existential fear. Neighbor watched neighbor with new, calculating, desperate eyes, measuring portions and observing reserves. The fear wasn't just of running out of food. The fear was of who would run out first, and what desperate measures the starving might take when the belly ruled the brain, erasing the thin veneer of civilized behavior earned over millennia. Every candle became an astronomical expense. Every drop of rendered animal fat, a luxury only the most careless could afford to waste. The nights were now absolute, terrifying blackness, punctuated only by the deep, resonant groans of the massive timber holding the terrifying snow load above their heads. But Mayor Dubois knew that simply waiting for death, calculating the exact moment of their collective demise, was not the Valençon way. A decision had to be made, a desperate gamble that risked 3 lives for the potential salvation of 300. They needed to know if the storm was localized, a freak event confined to their valley, or if the entire world had ended in a simultaneous, cosmic, meteorological catastrophe. They needed confirmation that help was merely stalled, not forgotten entirely. 3 men, Jean-Luc, the strongest and most stoic lumberjack, Marc, the silent, wiry hunter known for his mountain instincts, and young Pierre, whose eyes still held the defiant, almost reckless fire of youth, were chosen for the impossible mission.
Their task: breach the highest, most dangerous pass, the infamous Serpent's Tooth, and reach the small, forgotten mining outpost 10 miles beyond the valley rim, the last vestige of civilization before the Great Plains and the possibility of external aid.
The Serpent's Tooth was usually treacherous in midwinter, a vertical sheet of ice demanding ropes and courage. Now, under the crushing blanket of the October storm, it was an active death trap, a landscape of hidden crevasses and unstable powder. Every step was a risk of triggering a catastrophic slab avalanche, the mountain itself seemingly shuddering with malicious, indifferent intent, eager to swallow any who dared trespass on its newly claimed domain.
They were given minimal supplies: 3 days of dried jerky, a small vial of highly concentrated brandy, meant more for shock than warmth, and 2 antique, heavy-caliber hunting rifles, not exclusively for game, but for defense against any desperate 2-legged threats they might encounter on the fringes of civilization, where hunger had already taken root.
They wore snowshoes, cobbled together from old chair slats and leather straps, medieval ingenuity meeting a modern catastrophe. Their knowledge of the terrain was their only map, memory the only compass, as the landscape had been utterly erased by the unrelenting white shroud. As the three figures disappeared into the swirling vortex of white at the mouth of the valley, following the barely visible track of the frozen river, a terrifying silence fell upon Valençon. It was the silence of absolute commitment, the chilling silence of a people who had just sent their hopes, their final, desperate prayer, walking directly toward the very jaws of oblivion. Their survival was now a function of impossible physics and the sheer, brutal determination of three tiny figures lost in the indifferent, frozen heart of 1900 CE. The three figures, young Lucas, the aging hunter Maître Dubois, and the silent girl Ilara, were not merely walking, they were battling gravity, wind, and the sheer, unblinking malice of the 1900 CE winter that had no business existing in October. Every single breath was a shard of ice scraping against the lungs, a stark, painful reminder that they were trespassers in a domain utterly determined to claim them, turning their journey into an agonizing, slow-motion execution. Dubois, with his ancient, hand-forged crampons scraping uselessly against the glazed ice sheet that now coated the lower slopes, led the charge, his eyes narrowed against the blizzard that roared like a defeated god demanding sacrifice. He was the anchor of tradition, the man who carried the map of their past in his mind, a map now tragically invalidated by the cruel modernity of climate shift. Back in the valley, the air was thicker than the thin soup they no longer had, heavy with the terrifying sound of nothing. Their entire survival structure was based on a system of prediction refined over centuries, meticulous observations recorded in the massive, leather-bound almanac of years, a tome that was now revealed to be nothing more than the almanac of lies, a relic of a climate long dead. This book, which dictated when the final grain harvest must be brought in and the exact day the first snow should arrive, had been rendered criminally obsolete by the global atmospheric shifts of the industrial modern world they so stubbornly refused to acknowledge. The schedule had been destroyed not by a simple error of mathematics, but by the temporal violence of a world moving faster than their faith in tradition could keep pace with. They had calculated a critical buffer of 4 clear weeks between the last scheduled foraging trip and the traditional deep freeze. This catastrophic winter had arrived 29 days ahead of schedule, swallowing their meager, unharvested reserves in a single devastating meteorological ambush that spared nothing. Dubois' objective was the abandoned shepherd's hut, 6 grueling miles away over the infamous Widow's Pass, a route notorious even in high summer for its treacherous, crumbling slate paths and unpredictable rockfalls. Now, under a foot of fresh, deceptively soft powder, masking sheer, unforgiving glacial ice, it was a gauntlet of certain death, every step a calculated risk against gravity and friction.
Lucas, the youngest and strongest, carried the heavy, empty sacks, his shoulders burning with an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle strain, fueled only by the hollow, terrified image of his little sister's eyes back in the warmth-starved hovel. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the wind, that if they returned empty-handed, those sacks would ultimately become their village's shrouds. The cold was not simply a temperature. It was a living, malevolent entity, seeking entry through every gap and tear in their threadbare, century-old wool garments. It was a cold that didn't just freeze water. It froze the very possibility of the future.
Ilara walked slightly behind, her task the most crucial and the most silent, maintaining the pace and ensuring no one lagged behind, acting as a human anchor in the surging white chaos. She was not a trained tracker, but she possessed the mountain instinct, a primal alarm system that screamed when the snowpack was unsound, or when a sudden, terrifying gust signaled an avalanche shift high above them on the unseen peaks. Her mind, usually preoccupied with the simple, satisfying tasks of the summer dairy, was now a howling wilderness of existential dread, contemplating the horrific geometry of survival and failure. They were attempting a journey that their forefathers had expressly forbidden outside the summer months, a desperate throw of the dice against odds that were measurable only in bodies, not in quantifiable risk. The sheer absurdity of the situation, living in 1900 CE, yet being killed by medieval circumstances, was a silent scream in her head, a recognition of their profound, pathetic, technological obsolescence. Just beyond the mountains, trains were running, electric lights were flickering, and people were discussing the latest advances in telegraphy and wireless communication. But here, clinging to the frozen rock, they were Neolithic men praying to stone gods and the fickle spirits of the wind. They finally reached the terrifying mouth of the Widow's Pass itself. The wind instantly quadrupled in intensity, shearing off the top layer of snow and exposing the slick, blue, diamond-hard ice beneath. Dubois raised a hand, his breath freezing instantly on his beard like tiny, sharp jewels. He pointed toward a narrow, almost vertical chute they needed to traverse, a place they had ominously named the Dragon's Throat, for the way it devoured the sun.
As he took the first tentative step onto the narrow cornice, testing the stability of the footing with his heavy, iron-tipped staff, the sound came, not the roar of the wind, but a deep, sickening crack from below the surface, a sound of the mountain structure itself failing. The ice sheet, stressed beyond its limits by the early heavy snow loads, fractured instantaneously and catastrophically. Dubois didn't slip. The very ground beneath his feet betrayed him. A slab the size of a wagon broke free, and the veteran hunter, the man who held the keys to their immediate survival was instantly pulled into the sudden, horrific void of the mountain, a deep, unseen crevasse masked by the treachery of the early, blinding snow.
Lucas screamed, a sound instantly devoured by the indifferent storm. Ilara reacted with instinct honed by generations of mountain living, throwing herself prone and driving her heavy staff into the solid ground above the fracture line, but it was already too late to catch him. The light of the single lantern they carried vanished instantly with Dubois into the terrifying, fathomless darkness, leaving behind only the echoing sound of falling ice and the monumental silence of absolute despair. The survival mission had gone from desperately difficult to utterly impossible in a single cataclysmic, mountain-shattering moment.
The monstrous howling had finally ceased, leaving behind a silence far more terrifying than the tempest itself, the silence of absolute finality. The valley, once merely challenging, was now a tomb carved out of glacier. Every sound, every footstep crunching on the diamond-hard snow echoed the monumental scale of their failure. The calendar, the one relic of the modern world they truly understood, had betrayed them. They had gambled their lives on the predictable rhythm of the seasons, budgeting their precious stores of dried meat, root vegetables, and, most critically, fuel, to last until the spring thaw of April. Now, in the brutal grip of mid-October, the meticulous calculations of a lifetime were revealed as a fool's ledger. The village elder, Old Man Mathis, his face etched with the despair of a prophet who watched his prophecy come true, ordered the gathering in the communal longhouse.
The air inside the longhouse was thick with the smell of wet wool, fear, and the last burning embers of wood they dared to spare. No one spoke of rescue. They spoke only of numbers. Inventory Master Johann, usually a man of meticulous confidence, trembled as he laid out the figures on a worn, oil-stained parchment.
The first catastrophic revelation struck like a physical blow. The firewood. The main reserve pile, stacked neatly behind the mill, was gone. Not stolen, but buried beneath 15 feet of rock-hard, unyielding snow that had compacted into solid ice. The emergency supply, meant for February's deepest cold, was now their only asset.
Based on the current consumption rate, the minimum required to keep the weakest alive and prevent the infants from freezing solid, they had enough heat for precisely 47 days. 47 days until the last ember died, and the medieval chill claimed every soul in the valley. The food situation was a mirror reflecting the fiery desperation of the fuel crisis. The root cellars, dug deep into the earth and traditionally reliable against early frost, had been catastrophically breached by the sheer, overwhelming cold of the meteorological ambush. Whole bins of stored turnips and potatoes, meant to sustain them through the Lenten fast and well into the spring planting, were solid, unusable blocks of ice. The moisture had expanded, splitting the fibers and turning the vital starch into poisonous mush upon thawing, an immediate, irreversible loss of nearly 30% of their caloric reserves. Elder Mathis looked at the frightened faces, the mothers clutching their silent babies, the strong men staring blankly at the stone floor, and announced the new, terrible law. The rations were cut. Immediately. Cut by half. And then he added the terrible codicil that echoed through the stunned room like a death knell. Only the physically working adults and the children under 5 would receive the minimum allowance. The elderly, the chronically ill, and the non-productive were stripped of their portion. The implication was immediate, brutal, and understood by everyone in that room, even if the words were never spoken. The old and the infirm were now liabilities. They were not productive. Their meager rations would now be diverted to those who could still swing an axe, mend a roof, or nurse a child.
This was the ancient, terrifying calculus of the isolated valley. When resources fail, compassion becomes a fatal luxury. In the cities 100 miles away, doctors debated ethics. Here, the snow made the decision for them, demanding a sacrifice of the non-essential.
A muffled cry broke the tension. Old Marta, crippled by rheumatism, understood perfectly. She wasn't just losing her food. She was losing her purpose, her right to existence in the community's cruel new order. The survival instinct had instantly cannibalized morality. The meeting adjourned, not with hope, but with a terrible, forced resolve. They had 47 days of heat and diminishing food. To survive, they needed a miracle, or at least a highly unlikely resource retrieval. Far above them, clinging precariously to the lip of the treacherous Eagle's Spine Pass, was the high summer cache, a small, insulated cave where they stored emergency supplies for travelers caught out late, dried jerky, specialized climbing ropes, and most crucially, concentrated animal fat for rendering into lamp oil and emergency calories. This cache was usually inaccessible from November through March. Now, in mid-October, it was buried under meters of fresh, hostile snow, guarded by wind shear and avalanches that sounded like cannon fire. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only mission left. 3 men volunteered instantly. Elias, the strongest logger, Cale, the agile tracker, and young Thomas, whose desperate motivation was the life of his newborn sister. They knew the valley's unspoken law. If they failed, the valley died. There would be no second attempt. Their gear was tragically mismatched to the task. They wore thick, hand-woven wool cloaks and leather boots, effective against a typical December chill, but laughably useless against this meteorological weapon. They lacked the modern technological wonders of the outside world. No down parkas, no specialized ice axes, no high-calorie nutrient bars. Their tools were iron and wood,
passed down through generations of mountain survivalists, relics of a time that should have been long gone, but was brutally relevant once more. Their only concession to the modern age was a single, dim kerosene lantern, a beacon of hope and a cruel reminder of the fuel they were wasting. They looked like figures torn from a 15th century woodcut, yet barely 100 miles away, electric lights were flickering on in the burgeoning capitals of Europe, powered by dynamos and steam engines. The disconnect was a cruel joke played by geography and fate. While the outside world worried about tariffs and colonial expansion, these men worried about caloric intake and the precise temperature at which skin tissue froze solid, a calculation measured in minutes, not hours. Their enemy wasn't some distant political foe. It was the thermodynamic reality of ice and air.
As they prepared to leave, the women lined up, not to wish them luck, but to hand them tiny, hand-carved tokens, relics of faith and fear. Every eye held the same silent plea: bring back the fire, or don't return at all. They stepped out of the warmth of the longhouse and immediately into a world bleached white and utterly hostile. The cold was a physical weight, pressing the breath from their lungs. The snow wasn't powdery. It was a dense, crystalline mass that resisted every step, slowing their progress to a painful crawl. Every 100 meters cost them an hour of back-breaking labor. Kale, the tracker, saw the signs immediately. The snowpack was catastrophically unstable, layered like a flawed cake, waiting for the slightest vibration. A shout, a heavy step, the snap of a branch, to unleash a mountain's worth of destruction. They were walking not just on snow, but on a ticking clock. The mountain was actively trying to kill them, and their only defense was the desperate medieval knowledge of their ancestors. They were 3 small shadows, swallowed whole by the overwhelming, unforgiving majesty of the modern world's most dangerous relic: pure, unadulterated cold. The wind ripped through their thick wool, stealing the precious warmth generated by their exertion faster than their bodies could replenish it. It was a systematic, calculated theft of life force. The kerosene lamp, held high by young Thomas, cast feeble light, illuminating only the immediate horror of the vertical climb. The valley held its breath, listening for the sound of an avalanche, knowing that if they heard it, it would be the final sound of their history. The catastrophic ambush had claimed its first victims. Now it was waiting for the final, desperate act of defiance to complete the purge. The silence was the real killer, heavier than the snow outside. It pressed down on the few remaining souls huddled in the great hall, turning breath into visible prayers. Every cough echoed like a gunshot in the mausoleum of what was once a vibrant community. The calendar might have screamed 1900, but their reality was far older, far more brutal. This was not a slow slide into hardship.
This was instant judgment, delivered by the skies themselves. They were locked in a stone coffin, and the air was getting thinner by the hour. The food stores, the meticulous, centuries-old calculation that had governed their lives, were failing. They had planned for late November. They had received early September's apocalyptic fury. The grain silos, meant to last until the spring thaw, were already terrifyingly diminished. The mice inside feasting on the last hopes of the children. Chief Elder Alaric, his face etched with the geological maps of their valley's history, held the ledger. The numbers didn't just lie, they screamed. At the current, agonizingly sparse ration of dried rye, root paste, and a sliver of smoked meat, they had maybe 10 days. 10 days until the hunger became a weapon pointed inward, aimed at their own sanity, turning neighbor against neighbor.
The fear had curdled into a dark, thick despair. People stopped looking at each other, saving their energy, their gaze fixed only on the meager fire, the last visible warmth in a universe dedicated to freezing them solid. The children, usually the valley's noise and light, were unnervingly quiet. It's the silence of true starvation, the body conserving every single calorie, even the ones needed for crying. The most terrifying sound wasn't the relentless scream of the wind outside. It was the low, desperate prayer of Father Thomas, praying for a rescue that modern science swore was impossible to deliver to this forgotten corner of the world. Every flicker of the lamp meant fuel consumption. Every whispered conversation meant wasted energy. The valley was consuming itself, slowly and deliberately. They understood the ancient laws of the mountain. Once the balance is broken, the mountain always demands a debt. And that debt is always paid in blood and frozen bone. Their reserves, meant to tide them over until the conventional start of the long winter, had been annihilated by the sheer, overwhelming speed of the storm.
But survival isn't passive. It demands a sacrifice, a fool's errand wrapped in the banner of necessity. The critical calculation was the second wood cache and the supplementary hay stores they had left higher up, in the abandoned summer grazing huts. A 3-day journey in good weather. Now, under the iron fist of the ambush, it was a guaranteed death sentence. That cache held the fuel for the long haul, the energy to keep the massive furnace of the main lodge burning for another 3 weeks. Without it, the valley was guaranteed to die by the end of the next fortnight. The question ripped through the heavy air. Who would go? Who was brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to walk directly into the teeth of the meteorological ambush? 3 men stepped forward, their faces grim monuments to courage, not hope. Tomas the hunter, young, reckless, and the strongest on skis, known for taking impossible risks. Jarek the engineer, pragmatic and obsessed with maps, who understood the fatal flaw in their altitude calculations. And old Kale, whose knowledge of the mountain passes dated back to legends and inherited memory.
not charts.
Their mission was simple in name, impossible in execution. Reach the high cache, secure the fuel, and return before the mountain devoured them, before the cold turned their blood to slush. They strapped on rudimentary wooden skis, technology barely changed in 5 centuries, but underneath their ancient heavy wool cloaks, they wore the last vestiges of the modern world. Jarek carried a small, heavy brass compass, a marvel of metallurgy, utterly useless in the blinding, disorienting whiteout, and a single precious bottle of medicinal alcohol, a 19th century luxury meant for sterilization, now reserved only for pure, raw heat in their bellies should they face imminent collapse. They were men standing on the precipice of history, trying to fight a medieval enemy with fragments of a future that had already abandoned them. As the heavy oak door groaned open, a blast of icy air ripped through the lodge, extinguishing 3 of the precious tallow lamps instantly. It wasn't just cold, it was malicious. The blizzard was a screaming, physical entity determined to tear them apart the moment they stepped into its domain. Tomas secured the rope around his waist, the line symbolizing the last fragile connection between life and the other. They vanished instantly into the churning, blinding chaos, swallowed whole by the snow demon that haunted the high passes. The ascent was not a climb, it was a punishment. Every step was a battle against snowdrifts that rose higher than a man's head, soft, deceptive traps layered over ancient, unforgiving ice. They moved not by sight. Sight had been ripped away hours ago, but by the memory of the land, guided only by Cale's shaky internal map, checking the angle of the wind against the sheer face of the rock they knew was hidden somewhere nearby. Hours bled into an eternity of agony, punctuated only by the roaring tempest. Yarek's engineering mind screamed warnings about the structural instability of the newly fallen snow, but Cale urged them higher, driven by a desperate timeline. Then came the sound, a low tectonic rumble that started deep in the mountain's core, the unmistakable, deafening warning of an avalanche. The mountain was shedding its skin, and they were caught in the slough. Jarek screamed the warning, but it was too late. The mountain exhaled, and a colossal white wave of compressed fury detached itself from the ridge above, hurtling down with the speed of a runaway freight train. They dove instinctively behind a meager ice-coated rock outcrop, the snow blast hitting them with the force of 1,000 fists, tearing the makeshift rope from Thomas's terrified grip. When the world settled into a terrifying silence again, the air was thicker, colder, and Thomas was gone, swallowed by the newly deposited, crushing white tomb. The catastrophic ambush had just raised the stakes, demanding a second, immediate sacrifice. The 2 remaining scouts, Jarek and Cale, were now stranded, exposed, and utterly alone. Their precious map and compass useless against the sheer scale of the disaster. They faced the most terrible, impossible choice
any man could make. Search for their missing, almost certainly dead companion in the killing white, or continue the mission and save the starving valley, abandoning their friend to the mountain's eternal embrace. The clock was ticking, and the cold was unforgiving.
The wind howled a verdict, a frigid, ancient voice, screaming the truth they desperately tried to ignore. Mathis was gone, not merely injured, but swallowed whole by the mountain's icy breath, his life force extinguished faster than a match in a blizzard. To attempt a recovery would be a suicide pact, turning 2 desperate hopes into 3 frozen monuments to failure. The valley held hundreds of lives in its brittle hands, lives depending on the single, agonizing decision made here, 10,000 feet above the world, in this killing white void. The choice was not between life and death, but between one death and the annihilation of an entire lineage. Tomas, his eyes red, not just from the cold, but from the tears that instantly froze on his cheeks, ripped the vital rations pouch from Mattis's rigid coat. It was the last act of a comrade, a silent, brutal recognition of the valley's cold arithmetic, a necessary desecration performed under the watch of the uncaring gods of ice.
They didn't speak. Language was useless now, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of boots on the treacherous, wind-scoured ice, a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the suffocating silence of the high peaks. Every downward step was a betrayal, a psychological weight dragging them deeper into the exhaustion that promised delirium and eventual sleep.
The ice was no longer crystalline snow. It had transformed into verglass, a sheer, deadly glaze covering the uneven rock faces, turning their careful descent into a series of terrifying, uncontrolled slides. They were running on momentum and pure, desperate adrenaline, fueled by the image of the starving children waiting below, a terrifying mental slideshow of skeletal faces. This was the terrain of ghosts, where the difference between a successful foothold and a fatal plummet was measured in millimeters, and the fleeting grace of physics. The weight of the 1900s technology, the meager modern tools that mocked their medieval predicament, especially the heavy, useless mapping equipment, felt like lead anchors dragging them toward the abyss. They entered the area known locally as the Teeth of the Dragon, where the early, catastrophic snows had brilliantly masked the deep crevasses running through the lower glacial tongue. These fissures were yawning portals to eternal darkness, waiting patiently for a single misstep, a moment of profound fatigue that would end their mission instantly. The snow cover here was unstable, a treacherous layer of fine powder sitting atop jagged, immovable blue ice, creating death traps concealed by the blinding white uniform of the storm. Each step required testing the ground with their heavy staffs, listening for the hollow whoomp that signaled an imminent collapse into the void below, a sound they desperately prayed not to hear. They moved roped together, but the rope felt less like a lifeline and more like a shared tether to certain disaster, a chain linking 2 fates
that could be severed by one momentary lapse in concentration. If one fell, the other would have only seconds to dig in and anchor themselves against the unforgiving tug of gravity and the mass of their falling companion.
Down in the valley, the true extent of the meteorological ambush was becoming horrifyingly clear. The emergency caches, built centuries ago by their ancestors who understood the savage moods of the Alps, were dwindling with terrifying speed as the council desperately tried to stretch the remaining stores.
The dried meat, the Bündnerfleisch, meant to last until spring thaw, was being rationed down to microscopic slivers, providing caloric sustenance barely enough to keep the body temperature stable, let alone allow for the crucial physical labor required to clear snow and maintain what little infrastructure they possessed.
The old ones, the true historians of the valley, whispered of the great cold of 1709, a winter so brutal it halved the population. But even that legendary disaster had not struck with this sudden, annihilating force. This was a siege, not a storm, and the calendar confirmed the temporal irony. It was only early November, 1900 CE, and they were already facing famine. The cold seeped into their bones, silencing the internal dialogue and replacing it with a buzzing, detached white noise that numbed their fear. Hypothermia, the silent hunter, began its work, dulling their senses and inviting fatal apathy, the sweetest temptation the mountain offered.
Tomas started seeing movement in the corners of his vision, shadows that mirrored the shape of Mathis, walking beside them, silently judging their swift retreat and demanding to know the price of their survival. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the cognitive fog, knowing that hallucinations were the brain's final, desperate attempt to shut down before the core organs failed.
Elara, gripping the ice axe until her knuckles were white and useless with pain, focused solely on the repetitive motion, counting her steps. 1, 2, 300, 1,000, an endless numerical mantra against the chaos. If she stopped counting, the universe would stop, and the cold would win, swallowing everything in its wake.
They knew that succumbing to the temptation to simply rest, just for 5 minutes, would mean accepting the mountain's final, seductive sleep. The 1900s world might have electricity and telegraphs somewhere far away, accessible to people who worried about stock markets. But here, they were governed by Neolithic survival instincts and the relentless physics of cold.
The timberline, their salvation and first marker of reduced elevation, finally appeared through the swirling snow. Dark, rigid spires of pine trees that promised marginally thicker air and a break from the relentless high-altitude winds. It was still hours away, a distant black promise in the white hell, a brutal, exhausting trek across frozen waterfalls.
But then, a sound. Not the wind, not the crunch of ice, but something mechanical, something utterly alien to the medieval brutality of the storm they were suffering. A faint,
repetitive metallic clank, quickly muffled, then repeated with rhythmic persistence. Could it be the isolated, forgotten technology they had brought into the valley over the last decade, their only true advantage over the pure environment, suddenly seemed to be calling to them from the valley floor? It was the sound of the old water pump, their lifeline to the reservoir, struggling against the freezing conditions. The sound spurred them onward with a renewed, almost manic energy, defying the exhaustion that screamed for surrender. If that noise meant that the lower valley's defenses were still operational, that the community hadn't succumbed to the deep freeze, then Mathis's sacrifice, though horrific, had not been in vain. The final, treacherous slope lay ahead, a sheer drop requiring controlled slides and desperate leaps across slick rocks. They had to reach that sound. They had to deliver the news of the outside world, where the entire valley would perish in the embrace of the early winter. A final, horrifying anachronism, silenced forever by the mountains.